So we get motivated to start agriculture in order to get more and better beer, let's say. And then we discover you can make bread. It's also we had some leftover.
Just keep
Turns
doing
out
that.
you could actually make bread with this stuff too. And that's we start living in villages and towns, and we've always known that agriculture is what allowed civilization to happen. The kind of ability to produce surplus calories and have then specialization. So, we're not spending all day looking for food. We can now have, carpenters and metal workers. And that's where civilization comes from. And the initial impetus, the kind of thing that set us down that path, seems to have been this desire for intoxication.
Hello, and welcome to Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Hough, and I'm delighted that you're joining us as we get between the vines with some of the best wine writing out there. So sit back, pour yourself a glass, and enjoy the show with the Italian Wine Podcast. This month, our guest is Edward Slingerland, distinguished university scholar and Professor of Philosophy at the University of British Columbia. He's an expert in early Chinese thought, comparative religion, the cognitive science of religion, and humanities science integration. He is also the author of Drunk: How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having
You
me.
are, as I mentioned in the introduction, a distinguished university scholar. Could you tell us a bit about what your day job involves? What are your areas of academic interest and your teaching commitments?
Yeah, so my day job is early Chinese philosophy. So that's what I'm primarily a specialist in, and also comparative religion. At a certain point in my career, after grad school, I got into cognitive science and evolutionary theory. So I've been involved in kind of using both knowledge and methods from the sciences in the humanities. So to do my kind of historical and comparative work. So yeah, I run this project called the Database of Religious History, which is this big database of religious belief and practice throughout history across the world, all the way back to earliest archaeological records. Um, and I have a lot of freedom to write. So I teach at UBC in the falls, and then starting this year, I'll be at Dartmouth College from January to June, and teaching a couple courses there in the religion department. So it's a fun
Yeah,
life.
yeah, and
I have a lot of freedom.
yeah, and we could probably have a full conversation on any one of those areas of expertise, but they're certainly beyond my field of knowledge. One area that kind of bridges your academic interests, if you like, with a more mainstream audience, if I can put it like that, is the
Yes.
concept of the power of spontaneity, or trying not to try, which is the title of your
Hmm.
2014 book. So maybe could you tell us why is spontaneity so essential to our well-being, and what tips might you have for living a more spontaneous and ultimately fulfilling life?
Yeah. So the Trying Not to Try book, it was my first general audience book, and it came out of my dissertation and my first academic monograph, which was on this idea of Wu Wei, or effortless action in early Chinese thought. So this is a state where you're spontaneous, you're not monitoring yourself, you're kind of going along with the flow of things, and yet everything works out. You're very successful, you're socially successful and successful in the world. And the early Chinese philosophers that I study all want you to get into this state, that they think that's the way to live. But they all face this problem of the try not to try problem. How do you try to be spontaneous? If you're trying to relax, you
Hmm.
can't relax. And so I think the reason I wrote that Try Not to Try book is I think these early Chinese thinkers had an important insight, which that we, partly because of the influence of recent Western philosophy, maybe don't see as clearly, which is that there are certain goals in life that can't be obtained through direct striving. If you try to get them, you're going to mess them up. So things like
Mm.
happiness or charisma or creativity or love, these are things that you can't directly pursue. Yeah, you have to kind of prepare yourself and let them come to you. Um,
Mm.
and so this was something that I wanted to make available to a general reader. And then in the course of writing that book, Try Not to Try, there's a story in one of these early Taoist texts called the Zhuangzi about a drunken person who falls out of a cart and doesn't know that he was riding, doesn't know he's fallen out, and he's not hurt, and kind of jumps up and walks away. And he's used as a kind of metaphor for the sage, the Taoist sage, who's in harmony with heaven. And it's clear that it's a metaphor. At the end, the story, Zhuangzi says, if you can make your spirit whole this way with wine, how much more so can you do it if you're drunk on heaven? He wants you to be drunk on heaven. But I remember reading when I was writing about that story and trying to try. I was like, you know what? But wine's not bad. It's pretty does a
Yeah.
pretty good job, and that got me started thinking about how wine, alcoholic beverages, fermented alcoholic beverages, might be a cultural technology that we've developed to help us get beyond this paradox of trying not to try. So it's a direct
Yeah.
paradox when you're consciously trying to shut down your conscious mind. But if you use a substance that can go in and do the job for you, that gets you around that kind of psychological paradox. So it was my earlier work on spontaneity actually led quite directly to this more recent book on
I
alcohol.
did wonder, I was going to ask, in fact, if there was a link between the two, between the state of spontaneity and the role that alcohol plays. And obviously, as you say, there clearly was a link between those two lines of thought. But it's, yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, like, speaking from personal experience, I know that alcohol can be a useful social lubricant when you're in these sometimes awkward or difficult situations, and
Yep.
alcohol can just help you achieve. But I guess, like anything, there's a balance between to be struck between
Yes,
having
absolutely.
enough just to give you that confidence or that spontaneity, but too much and you end up a gibbering wreck.
Yeah, right, right. Most of the benefits that I talk about in Drunk from alcohol uh, kick in around zero point zero 0.08 blood alcohol content. So that's like maybe
Mm,
2 glasses of wine. But yeah, they're mostly coming to people when they're kind of
yeah.
lightly relaxed
Yeah,
by
it's very
alcohol.
interesting. And again, this is probably oversharing, but I've got a group of friends who I grew up with, and I guess over a kind of lifetime of probably drinking too much than is good for us. We've more or less come to the point where we consider that probably three pints is about the optimum level for being a kind of happy drunk and getting that that perfect buzz. Whereas anything more than that, it begins to have a slightly different effect.
Right, right. Yeah. So
Um,
that's probably you're hovering around zero point zero 0.08 there. So that
yeah.
seems right. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, looking at your bibliography, then drunk obviously clearly represents something of a departure for you, and you've told us how there's the link between this spontaneity, your 2014 book, and then your interest in the question of alcohol. What kind of reaction did you get from the academic community when you pitched this book, and how did your approach to this subject matter differ from your normal academic writing?
Um, yeah, so my colleagues were pretty baffled that I wrote a book on alcohol. Um, so yeah, but again, it's directly connected to my earlier work on spontaneity. It's also directly connected. The other main link with my earlier work, you mentioned that cognitive science of religion is one of the areas I work in. Uh, I've done a lot of work on essentially the problem of religion. So we take for granted that everywhere we look throughout history across the world, people are worshiping invisible beings, sacrificing valuable things to them, cutting off foreskin of their penis, tattooing themselves, building these enormous monuments. Um, and it should puzzle us more than it does that people do this stuff, because it's really, unless you believe that all of these gods exist and are helping these people, it looks like wasted behavior. And you would expect from an evolutionary perspective that individuals in cultures that didn't do these wasteful, useless things would do better than individuals in cultures that do. And yet, that's not what we see. We see that cultures that engage in incredibly costly religious behavior are actually quite successful. And so I really just was using the same kind of analysis to look at human intoxicant use. Because from an evolutionary perspective, we shouldn't be we shouldn't be drinking alcohol. We shouldn't be using chemical intoxicants.
Mm.
They seem like they're a physiological net negative. They're costly. They impose costs on us in a variety of ways. And yet, like religion, the production and consumption of alcoholic beverages is something you see across the world and throughout history. And so with the case of religion, what my colleagues and I have been arguing is that there's benefits that pay for the cost. So you get something out of religion in a way that is paying for the costliness of it. And that's what made me start to think, well, there's probably a similar dynamic with really with alcohol, that we've been doing this forever, across the world throughout history. There must be something beneficial that's paying for the costs. And so my colleagues in philosophy were a bit puzzled by the shift to this alcohol book, but my colleagues in cultural evolutionary theory were very interested. And in fact, I have some colleagues who tried to test some of the hypotheses and drunk against the historical record. So it's being taken seriously as a scientific hypothesis, um, and in general, the response has been really positive, because I wasn't sure. I thought I'd first of all I get a lot of angry emails from people who think that I'm celebrating alcohol and not aware of the costs and the dangers of it. But I think
Mm.
people did see that the whole point of the book is that alcohol is dangerous and costly, and so we need to explain why we do it. Um, but I think the overall reaction I've gotten from both colleagues and general public is, oh yeah, we know this. We kind of have this intuitive sense that alcohol, as you said, you know that it's a social lubricant, that you use it in these potentially awkward
Mm.
situations. So I think people have a kind of intuitive sense that there's a functional use to alcohol consumption, and they were just thrilled to have it laid out, not only laid out explicitly, but then supported with lots of anthropological and historical and scientific evidence. So overall, the reaction to the book has been really positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they say that the first line of a book functions as a powerful hook, its primary job being to grab the reader's attention. It sets the tone of the story and the voice and introduces that initial tension. And yours begins, people like to masturbate, which certainly grabs the attention.
Yeah,
How important was it, though, that you placed alcohol within the context of other numerous vices?
it's really crucial because you know the standard scientific story, to the extent that people have thought scientifically about why we drink, the standard hypothesis has been what I call the hijack, evolutionary hijack hypothesis.
Mm.
So we have a pleasure network that was designed by evolution to reward some behavior, and we figure out a way to trigger that network in a way that doesn't have anything to do with the original reward system. And that's masturbation's the classic example of that, right? It's the orgasm is designed to
Mm.
reward reproductive sex, because that's what our genes really want us to do. And yet humans and other species have figured out all kinds of wildly non-reproductive ways to get to get that same reward. Um, and so that's a classic case of a hijack. Um, in the case of masturbation, though, it's ancient and
Yeah.
ubiquitous. You know, we've been doing it forever and everywhere, um, but it's not very costly, despite what you might have heard in Catholic school. Or it doesn't make you go blind. It doesn't. You know, it's evolution can afford to kind of look the other way with something like that. And then I also talk about there's a more fringe view in the field
Yeah.
that maybe alcohol consumption is what I call a mismatch evolutionary mistake. So in a mismatch, the reward and the behavior actually were linked at one point in our history. So they were adaptive. It was an adaptive system, but the modern world has changed and made it non-adaptive. And so so I talk at the beginning of the book about masturbation and Twinkies, right? Because those are the two types of mistakes.
Mm.
So Twinkie junk food is a classic mismatch, right? We get rewarded for consuming fat and sugar because that was really adaptive for most of our evolutionary history. And in fact, there are still parts of the world where getting enough sugar and fat is a problem. So it was adaptive, but it becomes very maladaptive and dangerous in a modern industrialized society where we can get these ridiculous quantities of sugar and fat delivered to us, and it leads to obesity and diabetes and heart problems. But that's a costly mistake, but it's very recent and geographically limited. It's not everywhere in the world. And so evolution this is costly, but evolution basically hasn't had time to deal with this problem because it's so recent.
Mm.
And it's really important for me to lay out those two different types of mistakes because we can see in the case of alcohol, it's not like either one of those. Unlike masturbation, it's costly. Um, Unlike junk food, it's ancient and ubiquitous. So when you've got a behavior that's costly, ancient, and ubiquitous, something's got to be going on to pay for the costs. So that's why I started with. I mean, besides it being fun to start with masturbation and catching people's attention, it is intellectually crucial to my argument that our taste for alcohol is not like masturbation or our taste for
And
junk food.
where does the concept of addiction fit into this analysis? Is it not the case that drink so much alcohol just because our bodies are to some degree addicted to it?
Yeah, sure, that can play a role too. So, and that's going to vary from individual to individual. It's estimated that perhaps up to 15% of the human population has a is at risk for alcohol use disorder.
Mm.
So it has a tendency to have trouble controlling drinking. And we also know that ethanol is really powerfully addictive substance. So absolutely. So part of it, once you start doing it, it's partly self-reinforcing because you become physically addicted to it. But the question is why evolution lets that happen in the first place. Because, as I argue, so one possibility is just, it's an ancient problem, but evolution hasn't been able to fix it yet. And that's why it's very important in my argument that we see these basically genetic solutions to the problem exist in the world. So I talk about what's sometimes called the Asian flushing syndrome because it's most common in East Asia. This is a set of two mutations, and if you have these mutations, you don't like to drink because alcohol makes it makes your face red, it makes you nauseous, it gives you heat, flushing. It's really unpleasant, it makes you sick to your stomach. And having this mutation makes you not like drinking. It's very protective against alcoholism because if drinking alcohol is unpleasant, you don't do it. And in fact, a drug that kind of mimics the effects of having this set of mutations is one of the most used interventions in alcoholism. It's used as a treatment for alcoholism. And the set of mutations evolved at least 8,000 years ago, probably around the beginning of rice cultivation in what's now Southeast China. So the solution, evolution could have stopped all this because that mutation exists, and if alcohol were just costly and didn't have any benefits, that mutation should have spread throughout the entire world very quickly. And yet it remains pretty geologically isolated in East Asia. And it's evolved independently in at least twice in all parts of the world. And again, hasn't spread. So so physical addiction could be part of it, but that just begs the question of why evolution doesn't fix the physical
There are
addiction problem.
so many directions we could take this conversation in, but we are limited to
Yeah.
time. I wonder if a place to start maybe is this question of going back to the beginnings, if you like, of human civilization, where you argue that alcohol wasn't a byproduct of agriculture, rather that agriculture was the result of our need to increase the production of alcohol. So
Yeah.
again, it's this case of the first farmers were driven by a desire for beer rather than bread. What
Right.
what what evidence is there for that? What did you find when you were researching that topic?
Yeah. So that the so-called beer before bread hypothesis started to get advanced in the 50s, 1950s, by archaeologists who were noting this weird phenomenon of sites like, so a good example that we know about today is Göbekli Tepe in modern day
Mhm.
Turkey, where you've got hunter-gatherers coming together, building this massive architecture, um, these huge stone stelae carved with these weird figures. They're feasting, because so we have remains of feasting. They're having some kind of religious ceremonies and gathering in large groups way before agriculture. So we don't have agriculture yet in this part of the world. So these are hunter gatherers who are doing this. There are also at Göbekli Tepe we have these remains of gazelle bones and evidence of feasting, and also these huge vats that held some kind of liquid. And we don't have direct chemical evidence of beer making at that particular site, but we have it from other sites in the region. So it's pretty clear they're coming together, making beer, and possibly beer laced with some hallucinogens, and having these massive
Fantastic.
festivals. Yeah, yeah. So it was kind of like Burning
Yeah.
Man 12,000 years ago. Um, and so that led archaeologists to think, well, then maybe they start to, get interested in growing crops in order to enhance their beer production, not necessarily their bread production. And this gets then amplified. The evidence for it gets stronger when you look around the
Mm.
world and you see that every whenever you see agriculture start, the first domesticated crops seem to have been chosen for their psychoactive properties and not for their nutrition properties. So I talk about, for instance, teosinte, which is the wild ancestor of maize or corn. If you were interested in making tortillas, you would never notice this plant because it's got tiny little seeds. You just pass it right by. What it does have is this very starchy, kind of sugary stalk that you can ferment and make beer, make chicha out of. And so almost this plant was domesticated almost certainly to make beer, to make chicha first. Um, in North America, the first domesticated crop is tobacco, and they're using the tobacco they were growing is nothing like the tobacco we get in the corner
Mm.
store today. It was really powerful, and probably laced with hallucinogens. So throughout the world, you see this pattern where people seem to be motivated to settle down and start agriculture because they want to change their minds. They want to get intoxicated. So this is, it seems like a pretty convincing argument that um, in this way, civilization is quite literally uh, the result of intoxication. It's the result of humans wanting to get
Yes,
intoxicated.
I'll come back to that point in a moment. But one other thing that struck me, notwithstanding these powerful hallucinogenics that you mentioned, was that for the major part of human existence, we're talking about fermentation and therefore alcohol with a relatively limited alcohol content. Then, in only relatively modern times, you have the development of distillation, and it's really with the advent of distillation that we have more powerful alcohol and some of the more serious negative consequences of alcohol consumption. Is that a fair summary of of that concept?
Yeah, yeah. So I argue that alcohol has always come. So alcohol is dangerous, but it's always come with some safety features
Mm,
built in. And one of them is the limits that natural fermentation puts on how strong alcohol can get. So, yeast are producing alcohol as a basically biological warfare against bacteria that they're competing with. And they're more resistant to alcohol than the bacteria are. So they poison the bacteria first before they're affected. But they're not completely immune to negative effects of ethanol. So they shut down at a certain point. Humans have been ruthlessly breeding yeast to get stronger and stronger with regard to alcohol content. So we can get, naturally fermented beverages can get pretty strong in the modern world. So like a Australian Shiraz can maybe hit um, 16%, but that's a modern thing. For most of our history, we've been drinking like 2 to 3% ABV beers and maybe slightly stronger fruit wines. And the importance of that is, you mentioned, kind of 3 pints is
mm,
good. And that's three pints of like modern
mm,
supercharged, beers that can get up to like
yeah,
9% or whatever. Um, it's if you're drinking a 2% beer, it's really hard to get
yeah,
dangerously drunk. It's just physically
yeah,
impossible. You can't get that much beer in your stomach. And so that's a safety feature. It makes alcohol safer. Um, that safety feature gets completely disabled when we invent distillation, and suddenly we go from 2-3% beers to like 90 something percent distilled
yeah,
liquors. Um, those are just so wildly more powerful than anything we've ever had in our evolutionary environment that they completely overwhelm our physiological defenses. And it really, I think distilled liquor should really be viewed as a different drug
yeah,
than naturally fermented beverages. Even though it's still just ethanol, it's so strong that it's much, much more dangerous. And so, yeah, alcohol, and this is again, relatively recent problem. We really didn't start having fermented, distilled beverages widely available until like the 1600s in the West, maybe slightly earlier in China. But in the story I'm telling that starts 10 million years ago with our primate ancestors, that's yesterday. So it's a very recent problem.
yeah. Very interesting analysis. And to go back to the point you made before about there being no civilization without alcohol, what we're saying there is that without alcohol, the hunter gatherers wouldn't have settled, wouldn't have become farmers, wouldn't have created villages and then towns, and then organized civilization. Is that basically the crux of the argument?
Yes, yeah, it's what motivated us to start. So we get motivated to start agriculture in order to get more and better beer, let's say. And then we discover you can make bread. It's also we had
Yeah,
some leftover.
it's
Turns
the
out you can
net.
actually make bread with this stuff too. And that's we start living in villages and towns, and we've always known that agriculture is what allowed civilization to happen, the kind of ability to produce surplus calories, and have then specialization. So, we're not spending all day looking for food. We can now have, carpenters and metal workers, and that's where civilization comes from. And the initial impetus, the kind of thing that set us down that path, seems to have been this desire for intoxication.
And aside from just the sheer pleasure, if you could put it like that, of intoxication, you mean you also make the case that alcohol helps with creativity, it helps in reducing stress, it helps facilitate social bonding,
Hmm.
and I mean, I can certainly testify to all three of those. And to return to this question of three pints, it occurred to me when I was preparing for this interview. I was thinking of my granddad, as I often do, my late granddad, when I'm thinking about alcohol. And he was a man who, in the latter stages of his life, drank 6 pints a day, every day.
Wow.
And that seems like an
Okay.
awful lot until you think, well, he had 3 pints at lunchtime, and then he had 3 pints in the evening, and it was pints of extremely mild English beer, which is maybe 2 or 3%.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
And he was never drunk. He would come home in the evening and he would perhaps have a rum before bedtime, and that would maybe just send him over the edge. But he was very,
Right.
I very
Yeah.
rarely saw him drunk anyway, maybe when he was younger, perhaps. But
Yeah.
he's the epitome of self restraint. Even though on the face of it, 6 pints sounds like an awful lot of beer to drink in one day, he was a man that lived alone for a significant portion of his life, and that routine was of going to his local working man's club was
Hmm.
crucial to his social and mental well-being throughout his life.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
so, so what about the question of creativity? I don't think my granddad was a particularly creative person, but what evidence is there that
Yeah.
that that alcohol helps with creativity?
Yeah. I could talk just before I move on to that.
Mm,
Your granddad's a good example of, there's especially lately, there's been a lot of messaging from health organizations about, the dangers of alcohol, and the only safe level of consumption is zero, and, we should all stop drinking immediately. Um, but what's not considered is that, you know, another thing that's really bad for our health is loneliness
yeah,
and social isolation. And if, drinking the 3 pints at lunch and dinner got your granddad out of the house and seeing other people every day, and, gave him a network of support, and sociality, um, that was really preservative of his mental and physical health,
yeah.
right? It's all connected. Um, so yeah, there's the social lubricant, kind of social bonding function.
If I can just add to that, just thinking about it, the best conversations I ever had with my granddad, some of the best conversations I've ever had with anybody, were at that kind of sweet point between pint two and pint three, where he was
Yeah.
loose tongued, and I mean, it
Exactly.
just
Yeah.
it just seemed to help him relax a little bit and remember some of the his adventures during the war, for example, just stuff like that
Right.
that he wouldn't normally have otherwise have spoken about.
Yeah, and that's partly gets to the creativity thing. So the reason he was able
Mm,
to access those
mm,
stories is because his mind was loosened up a bit. And so, yeah, so, I talk a lot about the social lubrication, social bonding function of alcohol. The other main function that I focus on is this creativity enhancement.
mm,
So, um, one of the main effects of alcohol is to selectively depress the part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. So, this is really important part of the brain. It's in charge of, self-control, planning, kind of rational reasoning, um, delayed gratification, all these things that make you a successful grown-up. You need to have a fully functioning PFC. The one thing we know about it, though, on the negative side, is that it interferes with creativity. It seems like when you're being controlled by your PFC, you're very good at doing things like math or accounting. things where it's very clear I'm going from point A to point B to C. Um, what it interferes with, apparently, is what's sometimes called lateral thinking. Um, it interferes with the ability to connect things that are not obviously connected. It interferes with your ability to access kind of into insight, to have kind of creative solutions to things. It interferes with your ability to access memories. So that's what was going on with your grandfather, is he was able to access these stories because his PFC
Mm,
was
mm,
loosened up. Um, and a good example of this, you mentioned the first line of the book. Um, I actually I think I wrote like 12 versions of the
mhm,
proposal for the book, and my agent kept sending it back to me and said it's not good enough.
mhm.
And she was right. Like, it didn't pop. It didn't have that hook, even though all of the arguments and all the science and everything was already there. Um, it wasn't didn't draw you in. And what I realized was that I hadn't taken any of my own advice from the book. I hadn't written any of it drunk. Zero of that proposal had been written
Yeah,
while anywhere on the blood alcohol content spectrum. And so I was actually this was pre-COVID. I was at a conference and went down. I had a couple hours before I was meeting colleagues for dinner, so I went down to the hotel bar and ordered a Negroni and
that would do it.
and sat with my laptop, and basically at the end of Negroni number one, and I did order a second Negroni, but I think it was really the end of Negroni number one, that first line and what became essentially the first page or two of the book just revealed itself to me.
Yeah,
And it really, the feeling was very much that I was just taking dictation. I didn't feel like I was producing it. I felt like it was just part of my brain was finally like, thank God, the PSC is not in charge anymore.
yeah.
Here, you want to draw people in, start with
And
it.
I'm wondering, I mean, I get that about the creativity and the Negroni helping. Did you click send, or did you wait till the following morning when you'd kind of sobered up and in the cold light of day just double check what you read?
Yeah, absolutely. So write on alcohol and edit on coffee the next morning. But
Yeah,
the next morning when I
yeah.
woke up, I was like, yeah, this is good.
This is work.
It
Yeah,
works.
yeah.
And so yeah, so that's historically, there's always been this connection between alcohol and poets and artists and creative types, shamans, and there's a really good reason for that, and it's because of this the way in which it uh, turns down conscious monitoring and essentially allows you to recapture the kind of creativity you had when you were a kid, when you didn't have a fully developed PFC, because kids are really good at creativity tasks. They're very creative. Um, they just think of dumb things because they're kids. So I argue, that alcohol is this great trick because it gives us that same kind of cognitive flexibility while we're still grown-ups. We actually know what kind of problems we want to solve and what a solution might look like. So
That relationship though can sometimes be destructive. I think it would be fair to say when we're talking about artists or musicians or poets or whatever, that relationship with alcohol can sometimes go beyond creativity and there are countless artists I suppose over the years who have
yeah,
overindulged
no,
and
absolutely.
suffered
And that's
as a
again
consequence.
the kind of double-edged thing with alcohol. It's useful, but it's
Yeah, yeah.
dangerous.
So what then is the appropriate role for alcohol in society, or to be more specific, in a university, like in your workplace or in my workplace? I work in the wine sector, so it's difficult to avoid wine in my office. But
Yeah.
in terms of consumption or the extent to which institutions should be enabling or allowing the consumption of alcohol, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue
Mm,
because we've typically used alcohol, and so I'm in academia, and some of the best interactions that I had in grad school, for instance, with both my fellow graduate students and my professors, were over beer at the campus pub.
Mm.
We would have a seminar, and maybe after seminar, we would go to the pub and have some beers. Um, and I have colleagues in academia who, as a result of my book, have been saying, "Oh, yeah, right, we shouldn't, throw the baby out with the bathwater and completely get rid of those things because they're useful."
Mm.
But the reason people stopped doing them is because also sometimes people drank too much, people got sexually harassed,
Mm.
people who don't drink for whatever reason felt excluded. So
Mhm.
whatever, people have religious reasons, or they have alcoholic tendencies, or they're pregnant, or they just don't like the taste of alcohol. They were frozen out of these networking opportunities. So it is a tricky issue. I think we do have some new tools that help. So, non-alcoholic beer, for instance, non-alcoholic wine still is awful, at least as far as
Mhm.
I've um, been exposed to it. But non-alcoholic
Yeah.
beer has gotten pretty good. Um, and I noticed
And
this.
does that have the same impact on creativity, or does it need alcohol to?
No, you need al. Well, here's the thing, though. It can have a placebo effect.
Right.
So if you've had the real thing, if you've had
Mhm.
the ethanol containing stuff, a non-alcoholic version of it could give you a lot of the same
Yeah.
effect
Interesting.
just through placebo.
Mm.
But it unfortunately that will wear off eventually if you never have ethanol containing alcohol
Right.
again. But that helps level the playing field a bit. So I gave a talk about drunk in a pub in England at one point, and the guy who invited me was had alcoholic tendencies in his family and had a bad stretch of drinking too much and was not drinking. Um, but we're in a pub, and 10 years ago he probably would have been sitting there drinking a seltzer
Mm.
on the rocks while the rest of us had pints of beer. But they had a non-alcoholic beer on tap. So he had a pint glass with beer in it. And he was able to sit around with us and not feel weird or not feel left out. So I think there are ways to kind of get capture some of the benefits while being sensitive to people who don't drink.
Mhm.
Um, it's we also can emulate southern. I talk in the book about the difference between southern drinking cultures and northern drinking cultures,
Yeah.
and this is talking about Europe, but the quintessential southern drinking culture is Italy, as you know.
Mm.
And my ex-wife is half Italian, so we spent a lot of time. We have a lot of family there, and my daughter grew up going to Italy every year. um, and that culture, one way to look at it is it's been designed, in the sense that anything's in evolution is really consciously designed, but its function is to help you drink safely.
Mhm.
So you drink primarily non-distilled liquors, or non-distilled alcohols, so beer and wine. If you have distilled liquor, it's very small quantities,
Right.
as a digestivo or aperitivo. Um, you always are consuming it at a meal table. So, lunch and dinner usually, but it's always with food. It's always with a mixed group. It's old people, young people, men and women, kids. Kids get introduced to wine at an early age, with a little watered down when they're really little. But
Mhm.
they learn that just having wine with a meal is just something people do. Um, and drinking to the point of being visibly drunk is shameful.
Yeah.
You, it's embarrassing to get drunk so that people notice it. And it's northern drinking cultures are the opposite. The
Yeah.
point is to get really drunk, falling down drunk. You're drinking distilled liquors. You're not doing it around a meal. Um, it's your kids are forbidden to drink, so alcohol gets this kind of taboo
Mm.
appeal to it. And there's really good evidence that leads to dangerous drinking habits and alcoholism. So I think the other thing we could do is just try to emulate Southern cultures and you know, avoid distilled liquors, um, drink with other people
Yeah.
and around the meal table. Don't take in my first time visiting family in Italy, I was so excited to have access to Italian wines because I was living in Canada and it's just the wine's awful. It's just really expensive and bad.
Yeah.
And suddenly I could get these mind-blowing bottles of wine for like 10 euros. So I was very excited, and I after dinner I poured myself some more of this great red we were having because I wanted to take it upstairs and take notes on it. Um, and I got kind of a stink eye from my mother-in-law at the time because you don't take alcohol away from the
Yeah.
table, right?
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
weird to take it up to your room. It's just like, why would you do that? Um, all of those norms are really protective
Yeah,
against
and
dangerous
that
drinking.
desire, I think something else that you write about, that desire, whether it's conscious or subconscious, to conform with the group,
Hmm.
is, as you say, is an important safeguard when it comes to alcohol consumption.
Yeah,
Again, speaking from personal experience, as someone who came from Scotland and had typical alcohol consumption habits of a someone who'd grown up in Scotland, to come to Italy.
yeah,
I did, I have to say, for the first few years, try to conform to that more Italian
yeah.
lifestyle, and indeed, I probably still have to some extent, although I do have reverted back in some ways to a more unashamedly Scottish approach. But certainly when I'm thinking about
Right.
meal times, I very rarely now drink distilled spirits. Maybe the occasional whiskey every now and then, as you would expect. But yeah, I think it's all good, good advice.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's a couple of other big topics that I want to ask you about. I mean, there's the impact of COVID, but maybe we can move on from that, leave that in the past, unless there's anything in particular you want to say there. I wanted to talk a bit about the neo-prohibitionism movement that is emerging in the last couple of years, and you've compared the current strategy of the global health authorities with regard to alcohol. You've compared that to their approach to tobacco in terms of heavy tax and regulation, shifting public opinion, and gradually transforming the act of drinking into an almost unimaginable sin.
Right. Yeah.
To play devil's advocate here, I mean, to what extent are the concerns about global alcohol consumption legitimate, and the harm caused by alcohol when it comes to the healthcare costs, the risks to people's health?
Yeah.
Are those concerns legitimate, or are
Yeah.
governments and these agencies overreaching?
Yeah, so there's debate about that. The scientific consensus has certainly shifted in the last 5 years or so. And when I was writing Drunk, I was writing it.
That's the book drunk rather than writing under the influence of alcohol.
Yeah, when I was writing the book called Drunk, yeah, um, I was working under the assumption that alcohol is a net physiological negative.
Mm-hmm.
There used to be this belief that about cholesterol and the French
Mm,
paradox and maybe red wine's good for you. I think most doctors feel that any benefits from cholesterol reduction are far outweighed by carcinogenic problems and damage to the liver and everything else. So I think it is sensible to be worried about alcohol consumption. Again, if you have trouble drinking safely, you should be really worried about alcohol consumption. So I don't think the health warnings are
mm-hmm.
crazy. But I think what is problematic is this kind of exclusively looking at alcohol consumption exclusively through a clinical risk reduction lens. And that's weird because we don't do that about other types of behavior. So driving a car is bad for you medically,
Mm,
right? You'd be a lot safer if you didn't drive a car. But a lot of us drive cars because they're useful in other ways. And so there is this kind of weird monomaniacal focus on maximizing lifespan and kind of reducing risks no matter what. And that's a weird way to think about your life because there's, you know, beside again, hedonism aside, there are all these functional benefits to alcohol that are completely ignored by the prohibitionist view. And they're ignoring, as we talked about, the health benefits of socializing over alcohol. And I think that, in fact, loneliness and social isolation, just purely from a medical perspective, are much more dangerous than having 3 pints of 2% beer like your grandfather did. So I just think the public part of my motivation for writing Drunk was feeling like the public debate about this was really limited. We were only talking about costs. We were only looking at it from a medical perspective. And in order to make an intelligent decision about whether or not alcohol is going to be in your life as a person, as an individual, whether or not you want it in your organization when you're making kind of, administrative decisions. If you're a policymaker and you're trying to decide, should we try to tax alcohol out of existence? If it's COVID and you have to decide, what businesses should get to remain open and which should be closed, you can't make an intelligent decision unless you see the whole landscape of costs and benefits. And you may then still say, you know what, costs are too high, or this particular cost really worries me, and so no, we're not going to allow alcohol at the holiday party for our company. And that's a rational decision, but only if you're aware of what you're giving up when you don't have alcohol involved. And so my goal with Drunk was to just improve our decision making by showing us the whole spectrum of costs and benefits, and then where people end up in their actual decision making is really going to depend on kind of which costs and benefits they're worried about, and what their individual risk factors might be.
I just remembered one of the points I noted when I was preparing for the interview again from your book was this idea that applications for patents actually went down in the United States during and after Prohibition, and only rallied with the establishment of speakeasies. And a kind of indication, perhaps, of the power of alcohol when it comes to creativity and problem solving, maybe.
Yeah.
And I guess some of the problem solving that takes place around the periphery of an organization, whether that's when people are socializing after work or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
We could talk all day. It's such an interesting topic, and your book obviously raises so many interesting issues. So where can we get a copy of your book, and where can we follow you and your writing?
You can get it pretty much everywhere. It's been translated, and it's available in Italian and Spanish, and a lot of, I think, about 10 languages now. And my website is just edwardslingerland.com. So easy to find. And I've got, podcast interviews and articles, and also information on my other publications there.
As I said, it's a really thought-provoking and fun book as well to read. Really highly recommended, especially for those of us that are considering our New Year's resolutions as we start the new year. So, Professor Slingerland, thank you very much for being my guest today on Book Club. As I said, it's a conversation probably that we could have continued for some time, perhaps with a couple of low alcohol beers. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time. You've been extremely generous. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thanks for joining us on Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. Tune in again next month when we'll get between the vines with another great wine book. Remember, our show notes, including full details of all the books we've discussed today, are available at italianwinepodcast.com or wherever you get your pods.